First of all, welcome to my session. I'm glad you're here to BUS05. Compliance is a process. FileMaker is your toolbox. And if there are any stragglers, they're not the cool kids, because you're the cool kids and you're all here. So let's get going. That's right. All right. I'm Heather McHugh. I'm lead developer at Harmonix, Dallas-based FBA partner. And I'm not going to bore you by reading aloud the minutia of detail shown here on the slide. The gist of it is that I've been around a long while, and much of my FileMaker career has been spent working with compliance for regulated environments. Feel free to look up the slide deck if you really want the details there. Okay. A few caveats before we dive in. First of all, we will touch on aspects of security, but this is not a security session. If you weren't able to attend Tim Newdecker's session immediately preceding this, I urge you to follow up on his session materials. I also recommend Cohen Van Hulst's session, Securing Your FileMaker Server, tomorrow at 4:15. The processes and tools that we'll be discussing this afternoon are not specific to any particular regulation, but I will be referencing HIPAA, FDA Part 11, GDPR, CCPA, and Medicaid. Please also keep in mind that I'm not an attorney, but what I share with you today is based on 3 decades of FileMaker experience, nearly 2 of which have revolved heavily around compliance. Also, since it's still in that after lunch, middle of afternoon time, I have to tell you, this is not a honky-tonk or a stand-up. I'm not going to be doing any song and dance to keep you awake. My family and friends have assured me that my ability to retell a good joke has not improved with age, contrary to what I think. Anyway, no worries though, because I am confident that the very topic of compliance is going to keep you all riveted on its very own, keeping each one of you wide awake with excitement or maybe fear. You know. Seriously though, we need to quickly cover everything in a brief time this afternoon, so buckle up, hold your questions to the end. So what is compliance? It is quite literally the act of conforming to a rule, which could be a specification, a policy, a standard, or a law. And what do I mean by a regulated environment? Essentially, any controlled environment is a regulated environment. Here are just a few examples of what you may be asked to comply with. HIPAA and the HITECH Act, FDA Part 11, GDPR, CCPA, finance and other consumer protection laws, and a multitude of client requirements. Not that any of you have ever been exposed to client requirements, I'm sure. It's important that you understand that the particulars that you find yourself needing to address can vary greatly depending on the environment's controlling authority or authorities, and of course, the scope of your client relationship. I myself have spent the last several years working on a project, a system that is regulated by HIPAA, in addition to multiple entities within the state of New York. More about that to come. The General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is a set of rules designed to give EU citizens more control over their personal data. And we can all get behind that idea. But it applies to organizations in EU member states, and it also impacts businesses and individuals both across Europe and globally. And by the way, the term personal data in GDPR extends well beyond what we here in the States would consider personal data. It includes details such as eye color, political affiliations, and even union membership. And the GDPR, it's got teeth. It allows the data protection authorities in each country to issue sanctions and fines to the organizations that it deems in violation, up to a maximum penalty of $36 million or 4% of global revenues, whichever is higher. So it's not a joke. In fact, British Airways was recently fined $230 million for a violation comprising personal details of its customers. The California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA, CCPA, which many of you may not have even heard of, actually takes effect this coming January 2020. CCPA takes inspiration from the GDPR and is considered in some ways to be even more onerous. And beyond the GDPR and CCPA, there are currently 6 bills under consideration in the US Senate. So there's no question that the dominoes of data protection have begun to fall, and consumer privacy regulations included. Whether they advance on a state-by-state basis or via new federal privacy laws, we as developers, we need to pay attention. We need to be aware, because we could be at risk. Our clients could be at risk. So, how will successful compliance be defined? Or asked in another way, how will you know you've actually achieved compliance? Will your work be evaluated by an external entity as it would be with FDA validation? Will you self-validate? Yep, I did what I thought I should do, right? Or will your client make the determination that you've been compliant? And beyond your own internal QA, what will you do to facilitate client acceptance? Now at Harmonix, we've developed our own tool for writing and publishing test plans for client acceptance. We'll talk about that again later. We often fear what we do not understand. Our best defense is knowledge. This is a most appropriate quote from Star Trek Voyager's Lieutenant Tuvok. So what knowledge must we have to stave off our compliance fears? We need to know what's actually expected of us and that we have options. Remember, knowledge fosters confidence, and confidence conquers fear. I'm a firm believer that regulations needn't be scary, but it's only natural that we would question our ability to comply with unfamiliar regulations. After all, who among us truly enjoys a generous dose of legislative legalese? Lunch, breakfast, appetizer? No. However, I believe even complex requirements can be demystified, which will reduce fear, clarify the requirements, and establish responsibilities. So how do I demystify regulations? I translate them from jibber-jabber to FileMaker, which I do by following 3 simple steps. Oops, I'm moving in the wrong direction, so sorry. I do by following 3 simple steps in this direction. All right. First, understand the rule. It's been my experience that paraphrasing complex rules helps to ensure that you understand the objective and goals of your requirements. Step 2, tell the story. Telling the story will not only help you in fleshing out the context and other details, it will also help communicate with your client and your development team. It can also establish a foundation for boundaries. And step 3, choose the best approach. This is where you'll apply your FileMaker chops. As an example, the general provision about business associates from HIPAA is 61 words long, and you don't have to read it. It'll be in the slide deck if you're that interested, right? Like I said, we don't all enjoy legalese. But I've paraphrased it down for clarity to just 23 words. Your client needs your assurance in a written contract that the protected data to which you have access will be safeguarded. Now, without getting into too much critique, it pretty much covers everything that's in those 61 words. It doesn't leave anything out. It's just paraphrased for understanding and clarity. Step 2, tell the story now. When it comes to your own narrative, here are a few tips to keep in mind. Stay true to the intent of the rule, because this is your backstory. It establishes the context of the rule itself. Remember that interpreting specific objectives within the context of the solution will focus your effort to help avoid over-engineering. So this is not just for your client's benefit and your understanding, but it'll actually help you in your development efforts. And use lay terms. This is not the place for elaborating on your techniques, no matter how cool they are, okay? And finally, expand the story to include elements that are implied or that will be impacted by external factors that aren't specifically referenced by the rule. Now, I'd like to share a few additional thoughts on storytelling, because storytelling often unearths those finer details that are essential to achieving compliance. Plus, stories are relatable to the client's workflow, and they help to clarify your development objectives, as I was implying earlier. Clients convey their requirements to us in black and white usually, but stories add true color, texture, and tone. A story provides a more detailed overview. And we're conditioned to listen to stories. And the closer they are to familiar experiences, the more we enjoy listening to them. And in translating the jibber jabber into stories, we provide a common voice between the client and the developer. So step 3, choose your approach. And remember, this is where you get to apply your FileMaker chops and shine. And you'll do this best when you compare and evaluate before choosing. So compare your options. Consider what's best for this custom app and why. Evaluate the options. Weigh the risks and benefits, if any, of each option. And remember that what you've done before may or may not be sufficient or even appropriate for this particular custom app. For example, prior use of a plugin may not be as feasible for 300 users as it once was for 10. And newer, more efficient or better fitting options may now be available. And it bears repeating, choose the most appropriate option for this custom app. So the demystification of requirements is as simple as 1, 2, 3, right? You got that, you remember that. Let's try it out using an actual requirement from HIPAA. And by the way, don't make the all too common mistake of misspelling it as though it were one of Africa's big 5. It's not a HIPAA. It's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, spelled HIPAA. So step 1, understand the rule using Paraphrase. Now this excerpt from HIPAA, which I won't read, you feel free to read it later, this establishes what covered entities and their business associates must do. And the paraphrasing here is actually 3 words longer than the rule because it more explicitly clarifies when the requirements are applicable. So our paraphrase is, the app must ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, always, inbound, outbound, during entry, and at rest. Important caution about step 1. Do not summarize the rule. Summarizing abbreviates, and abbreviating can omit essential elements, which heightens the likelihood of misunderstanding or even non-compliance. Remember, paraphrasing restates for clarity without actually excluding detail. So in this summary, the data must be protected at all times. It's too vague. It clarifies nothing because too much has been omitted. Protected from what? When? And how does this address availability? It doesn't. Step 2, tell the story by describing the behavior. And remember, describing the behavior also defines expectations. So this custom app will ensure confidentiality by limiting visibility to authorized individuals. We'll also ensure integrity by restricting editing to authorized individuals. We will ensure availability of data by maintaining a robust backup schedule, including off-site retention, and maintain all reasonable and appropriate protections during inbound and outbound transfers, data entry, and while at rest. Now, your story, like this one, may even suggest an approach like a backup schedule, but you should refrain, again, from defining specifics or technique. Note, for example, that our descriptive narrative does not define the frequency of a robust backup schedule. The story is not the place for that, okay? Conversely, we've introduced off-site retention, an element that wasn't specified by the particular rule that we were translating here. And we've included it because we know that it's essential to ensuring availability. Your first pass at a narrative, at least my first pass at narratives, they always spawn additional questions. And the answers to those will naturally begin to frame the most appropriate direction for choosing a specific approach in step 3. looking specifically at the first statement from our narrative, ensure confidentiality by limiting visibility to authorized individuals, how will authorized be defined? Specifically, what visibility is it that we're supposed to limit? Are we talking about entire records or just specific fields? And are there any exceptions? What about reporting? Will there be users who need to run reports that, for purposes of either generating stats or a host of other legitimate reasons, require access to otherwise restricted records? And are there any environmental considerations we need to consider when we're making our choice? Which brings us to step 3. Choose the most appropriate approach by comparing options. Still focusing on that first of the described behavior's 4 elements. We're considering 4 options. FileMaker accounts and privileges are absolute. They provide maximum and uniform controlled access across all environments, but with limited flexibility. Roll your own privileges provide maximum flexibility, but they require a considerable implementation effort. UI controls can be linked to the user experience, but UI controls are applicable only where explicitly implemented. And remember, things like restricting visibility on a layout doesn't restrict access to a script, which is why you may find that you need to consider options such as field-level validation. In our example, authorized is a state that's expected to change. So it requires a level of fixed flexibility that's more difficult to maintain with privilege sets alone, and even more so with external authentication where groups are managed outside of your custom app's realm. Time for a sip. All right. So we've gone with user and role-based privileges as our choice, which is worth mentioning would always be an additive to the foundational protections of accounts and privileges and encryption at rest. Now, having chosen our approach, it's now appropriate to establish additional relevant details as an outline for our implementation, as well as for documentation and client communication, so everyone's on the same page. So to implement this, we'll define master roles and master privileges. Then privileges can be assigned to each role, and 1 or more roles can be assigned to each user. And as you'll see in the demo a little bit later today, here this afternoon, users will inherit all of the privileges that are associated with their roles, and explicit privileges can also be assigned directly to a user irrespective of their regularly assigned roles. And because role and privilege assignments are managed entirely by the client, they have the flexibility and control necessary to handle both short and long-term personnel issues. We can then restrict visibility and access via UI and schema-level controls. Next, we'll apply the same principle to translate a real-world Medicaid requirement. But first, let me provide some context with the backstory. Our client, Independent Support Services, or ISS, is a leading fiscal intermediary nonprofit agency in New York, and they provide administrative support to the developmentally disabled population who are self-directing. And for a person with a developmental disability, self-direction means being able to have real control over their life. Self-directed people have supports that are customized uniquely and specifically to them. As the fiscal intermediary, ISS supports the implementation of self-direction, or SD plans, as we refer to them, by allowing participants and their families to identify their own services and supports, have employer and budget authority, and co-manage an approved budget. Now, when we began beta testing the timesheet entry, which was the first module that we delivered to ISS, the payroll clerks referred to their new solution not as FileMaker, but as Harmonix. And the name stuck, and who were we to argue, right? So the Harmonix app allows ISS to manage the plans, the budgets, the expenses, and payroll for thousands of SD participants and their support staff. In addition to the requirements that come with ISS being a HIPAA-covered entity, the majority of the SD-related costs are actually covered by Medicaid, so naturally additional restrictions apply. I'm going to share one of these with you now. Again, following our 3 steps. Step 1, understand the rule. Medicaid will not pay for mileage incurred on days that support staff didn't work. Makes sense. But this rule does not apply when we're talking about mileage reimbursements being paid to the participant themselves, or perhaps someone in their circle of support that isn't a support staff or employee. So our paraphrasing is more specific. Support staff can only be reimbursed for mileage incurred on days they actually worked. It's pretty straightforward. When this occurs, by the way, it's usually the result of a correctable error. However, sometimes it's not an error, which brings us to the F word, fraud. Broken rules may indicate fraud, or they may just be errors that need to be corrected. In either event, the broken rules need to be identified. So for step 2, we'll tell the story about detecting possible fraud in mileage expenses. And we'll do that first by describing the expected result, which is to reject mileage expenses if the submitting staff did not work for the participant on the dates claimed. Then we'll share an example. So if Annie submits Tuesday mileage against Joe's budget, but she only worked for Joe on Monday, then we'll share our conclusion, which is that Annie submitted mileage for a date she didn't work. And of course, going back to our original, we're going to reject it as a result of that. Now, in Annie's defense, I should add that the vast majority of errors are in fact correctable, and these include data entry mistakes such as a date error either on the timesheet entry or the expense entry, or perhaps a timing issue like the person did actually work on the date they're claiming mileage for, but the timesheet got processed after the expense report. Before I share how we chose to comply with this particular requirement, I should mention that the rules have been known to change, often with little or no notice, and sometimes even retroactively. And that's because ISS is subject to not only the rules that are set by Medicaid, also they're subject to multiple state entities and departments, none of which comply to our timelines. There also are currently 34 separate violation possibilities that Harmonix is responsible for detecting and preventing. Only one of which is support staff asking for mileage reimbursement on dates they didn't actually work. So with this in mind, we chose in step 3 to support our client's need to verify multiple requirements by testing each expense and line item separately for each applicable rule. And because a 20-line mileage expense requires 291 evaluations, that's 11 at the expense level and 14 per each line. We chose not to use UI options like conditional formatting or hide conditions. I'm sure you can imagine the impact that that would have had on performance, right? So we chose instead to add a validation component to the schema and to integrate the execution of server-side validation testing into the workflow. So following entry by the AP clerk, validation occurs, and if the expense passes all of the validation tests, it's automatically sent to bookkeeping for payment. If it fails even one of those validation tests, it's returned to AP with detail on which errors they need to be looking into. So recapping now our rule to code translation. Understanding the Medicaid rule. We paraphrase the requirement to clarify our understanding of the Medicaid rule that support staff can only be reimbursed for mileage incurred on dates they actually worked. We told the story describing fraud-related errors and what was expected, which was to reject the mileage expense if the submitting support staff didn't work for the participant on the dates they claimed. And we chose an approach that was appropriate for the Harmonix app, which was to apply a validation test to mileage line items and to reject expenses if support staff didn't work on the dates being claimed. Personally, I've yet to meet a compliance requirement that couldn't be addressed using the FileMaker Toolbox. That's why we're all here. As I stated earlier, FileMaker's native security provides a universal, uniform security model across all environments. And the core elements that are available to even the most basic of custom apps include accounts and privileges, field level validation, and secure container storage. I would add that even when encryption is not explicitly required, encryption at rest should be employed by any app containing protected or sensitive data. UI tools that can be employed in support of compliance include your custom menus, hide conditions, conditional formatting, button bars, even slider panels, of course, script triggers, cards, and so much more. And for years, FileMaker has provided us with a powerful procedural language in the FileMaker script engine. This supports and enhances our ability to control the environment. We can flexibly enforce constraints and enable functionality as needed. We can trigger behaviors and constraints on a case-by-case, object-by-object basis. We can also offload processes to the server, both on demand and in a scheduled fashion, allowing us to support workflow and performance requirements as well. And let's not forget about JSON and FileMaker's data API. Now, as I said earlier, this is not a session on security. It is a session on compliance, isn't it? It's not a session on security. But I would be remiss if I were to exclude entirely the robust security options that are native to FileMaker, because FileMaker's native security options deliver absolute field, record, and layout level controls across the entire platform. And that can't be said of others. Now, I do have a few reminders I'd like to share with you before we move on. Accounts and privilege sets, which include external authentication and OAuth, do not allow externally authenticated accounts with full access. Bad, 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 okay? If I didn't say that, Stephen Blackwell would never speak to me again. Also, don't forget to exclude FMAP from your web-only accounts, and remember that access to both exports and printing should be controlled. I mean, we all know that. They're off by default in new privilege sets, but once they're turned on, they've been enabled, it's real easy to forget about them. And as you add new roles, new people, new requirements, these are things you need to be revisiting, okay? With regard to disconnecting idle users, don't forget that your server-side idle disconnect works in conjunction with your privilege sets. One does not work without the other, okay? And finally, make a point to familiarize yourself with the new FileMaker 18 feature, Trusted User Limited Access. Now, having personally implemented encryption in multiple solutions prior to encryption at rest, all the way back to FileMaker 5.5. Let me give a big shout out to FileMaker on this one. Thank you with love, seriously. I don't even want to think about it. It's scary. If I had to tell the stories, it would require drinks, I think. All right, so moving on. There's so many things that we can do with JSON that are nothing short of mind-blowing in my opinion. But these are my top 5 compliance-related reasons for loving JSON. First of all, of course, is audit logs. Next, alternate data modeling. Number 3, audit logs. Number 4, data blobs. And number 5, audit logs. You might notice a trend here. JSON, audit logs, JSON. There's a lot else that we can do with JSON. We've really, truly done some amazing, magical things with it that had nothing to do with compliance, but audit logs, wow, awesome. Okay, let's talk about some UI controls. FileMaker provides us with an extensive suite of UI controls. Hide conditions. They allow us to easily prevent things that shouldn't be possible, rather than telling the user that they don't have permission. It just makes for a better experience, right? Modal windows, they've allowed us to control processes for a while now, but cards are far more elegant in my opinion. And they're more consistent with other familiar user experiences, such as online interactions and mobile apps. Custom menus, they're essential. Use them, know them. We can combine FileMaker's powerful calc engine with button bars to further customize the experience and control it. And script triggers, they resolve a host of otherwise challenging compliance requirements. And let's not forget about conditional formatting, popovers, on-timer scripts, and custom functions. They all contribute to compliance. Now, a few deployment considerations for you to keep in mind. After I take a sip. All right, first off, if your decision on HTTP versus HTTPS isn't clear, ask yourself some questions like, are you communicating to a man in the middle? Are you using a casual API, like say Bubba's Hotspot? Or a more mature app like API like Authorize.net? And don't under-secure your server by using the default certificate. Remember, you can purchase a wildcard SSL certificate, and a wildcard cert gets cheaper as you start to add more servers. So do not under-secure your server. Beware of deprecations. Now, FileMaker is a stable platform with a history of dependability, but it happens. FileMaker will be deprecating PHP API access, for example. ESS, how are you securing your SQL tables? And how are you authenticating your SQL tables? And of course, FileMaker's Data API. For those of you who aren't already familiar with this, FileMaker's Data API is a tokenized model, which versus PHP access, which requires you to pass username and password, is far more secure. So check it out if you're not familiar with it yet. And a few more deployment considerations. Who should have access to the admin console? Will you be implementing external accounts or OAuth, or some combination of OAuth external accounts and FileMaker accounts? Who will be responsible for managing the backups? And regarding your firewall port management, remember that the least possible access that allows the necessary connections, that's your target, that's best. Access may be a requirement, but it needs to be the right access. What are the external rules of use, if any, such as Amazon Web Servers contracts? And looking ahead, think about things like your plugins and other dependencies. Should you consider S3 buckets, RESTful API versus SOAP? And are you prepared to handle a security breach notification? Are you even familiar with why you might need to do that? These are things you want to take into account. Bottom line, the adage of develop first, secure later, it's outdated. Because if you think about it, when are we ever done developing? We can't wait. We've got to think about this ahead of time. All right. Now, before I get into some of the specific techniques that I found most helpful, I want to discuss an increasingly common requirement. Does everyone here know what an electronic signature is? Show of hands? You sure? Okay. Do you know what it means to the specific client, the specific compliance that you need to meet, that you have to comply with, okay? Our John Doe here, for example, it's a fine specimen of a digital signature, but it is not an electronic signature. Digital signature is not an electronic signature. An electronic signature is intended to provide a secure and accurate identification method for the signatory, which on the surface sounds a lot like, hey, a handwritten signature would achieve that, right? Well, your definitions of electronic signatures vary depending on the applicable jurisdiction. There are, however, 4 elements that are common denominators in most countries. They include the signatory can be uniquely identified and linked to the signature. The signatory must have sole control of the private key that was used to create that electronic signature. And the signature must be capable of identifying if its accompanying data has been tampered with after the message was signed. And in the event that the accompanying data has been tampered with, the signature must be invalidated. Your digital signature can't do that. Now, as much as I'd love to demonstrate a plethora of compliance-specific examples from the FileMaker Toolbox for you today, our time is short. However, Harmonix plans to publish a series of compliance-related videos and demos for the developer community, conversations on compliance. Some of the topics will include role-based privileges, which will explore how to implement a flexible data-driven privilege schema, Audit logs will explore a variety of FileMaker native audit trail options. Anti-fraud validations will implement a flexible data-driven validation model, like I described earlier, that provides for multiple result types and an unlimited rule set. I expect the series to also include custom menus, multiple UI controls, and quality assurance. So if you'd like to be notified when these are made available, please follow the link that I've included at the end of my slide deck. Let's take a peek and preview some of this. We're going to take a look first at assigning roles and privileges. We're going to start by adding a role. And you'll see that we've inherited a privilege. We inherited the C passwords privilege. Let's try a different role. We're going to assign bookkeeping. And we can see that additional privileges were inherited by virtue of the role that we assigned. We also have the option in a system like this that's custom to directly assign specific privileges. So we'll assign one of those. And of course, let's say someone is going to be out sick and someone else has to take on that role, we might need to disable a role. So we can do that, and doing so automatically removes the inherited privileges associated with it. If we turn it back on and return to our summary, we can see that I've assigned myself 2 roles and explicitly 1 privilege, and I have 5 inherited privileges. Now, taking a look at custom menus, we can see first that our standard, let's see if I click the, did it start? Yeah, okay. Our standard FileMaker menus, we can see new, duplicate, and delete in our records menu. But if we select management menus, duplicate is gone. Right? So the keyboard shortcut D isn't going to accidentally duplicate anyone's records. And if someone were to select, whether by keyboard shortcut or from the menu, new or delete, a scripted action is going to occur instead. When we move to basic menus, they're not there at all, keyboard or otherwise, so if we want to give them those privileges, those functionalities, we'll have to give them a button or some other access to it. And of course, modal menus usually are going to have nothing other than perhaps those keyboard shortcuts that someone needs while they're editing a field, because they will have no menus, obviously. Now, our exploration into trigger-controlled object access will, in addition to sharing the code behind it, illustrate why the same script with the same parameter attached to the same script trigger can behave differently based on the field's formatting. So it's a quick demo of that. You can see we can edit our checkbox field, but we can't even so much as enter a regular field. With a different setting, we can enter our field, but we can't edit it. You can't see what I'm trying to delete there. Yet I can't even enter the checkbox field. And of course, when we turn it on, we can do everything we want to do. So that's something we'll explain in more depth and share the scripts that we use for those type of object controls. FileMaker is part of a larger ecosystem. And frankly, with limited exception, we simply can't exist and do what we need to do without it, not anymore. Now, within the FileMaker platform, Pro Advanced is just the first of multiple access points. We also have Go, Server, Cloud, Web Direct, and Custom Web Publishing, and more recently, the FileMaker Data API. But you also need to consider what else is within the sphere of your ecosystem. Here are just a few examples from the unlimited possibilities beyond the FileMaker platform. Amazon S3, your simple storage system, calendars, iOS SDK, QuickBooks, DocuSign, SQL, Salesforce, and the list goes on. Now, the first and most important consideration when supporting compliance across multiple environments within and beyond the FileMaker platform is an evaluation of risk. Your custom app's level of risk will not only guide the choices you make for addressing requirements, but it also serves to inform you and your client when it comes to defining responsibilities. With the exception of environments like an FDA-validated app, which requires total version control, most of our apps are ever evolving, which means our initial risk assessments will need to be reevaluated, though often within a more limited scope of a particular feature or perhaps the introduction of a new access point. So, what does your risk profile look like? How many users do you anticipate? And on which platforms? Go, Pro, custom web publishing, or perhaps data API. What's your mix? And remember, more users equal greater risk. Access points, they exist to support communications in and or out, so naturally, each introduces a potential point of vulnerability, which obviously increases risk. FileMaker first. What I mean by this is you should consider your requirements from the context of FileMaker first. For one reason, it's familiar to us. Again, understanding what we're doing is step one, right? So, consider it from the context of FileMaker first, then overlay those requirements and your approach to addressing them onto each additional access point. Is the requirement even applicable? If the requirement is, for example, to encrypt PHI and a SQL transactions table used for reporting contains no PHI, do you need to encrypt that SQL table? And if a requirement is applicable, will your approach in FileMaker extend elsewhere? Obviously, encryption at rest in FileMaker is not going to encrypt that SQL table for you. So if not, how will you, or perhaps a trusted source, address it? Now, I believe it was Bruce Lee who said, a wise man can learn more from a foolish question than a fool can learn from a wise answer. Don't be foolish or shy. It's essential that you honestly determine what you can do versus where it may be preferable to retain others. Should you, for example, consider outsourcing your document retention? And finally, no one looks forward to giving or receiving potentially bad news, but if you're able to share your concerns, which you have a responsibility to do, while also offering viable solutions to address them, you can be the hero. An honest risk assessment can actually open the door to expanded opportunities. And as I said just a few moments ago, it'll also help you define limits and establish responsibilities. Now, there are a number of factors external to FileMaker itself that we also need to consider because they unequivocally affect our ability to deliver. It's also important for you and your client to be on the same page about which of these you will and won't be responsible for, and if not you, who? It's been my experience that the more regulated the environment, the greater the likelihood that you're going to be working with the client's internal or outsourced IT department. And this is perfectly fine. In fact, sometimes it's even preferable. But when you rely and depend on fellow professionals, just remember the mantra, trust but verify. So, who's responsible for the systems and hardware? What does the network look like? Is it LAN, WAN, remote app, terminal server, VPN, etc.? What about web services? Who's responsible for routers and other security devices? And will they follow your recommendations? Are there any external policies, like I mentioned earlier, that you need to take into account, such as Amazon Web Services? Are identity management and monitoring systems part of the mix? Now, this slide could have been titled Managing Expectations, but experience says communicate early, communicate often. Now, we all recognize the chasm that often exists between what we've promised and the client's expectations. But how often have you fallen victim to my most vulnerable trap? Many of you will recognize this scene. You're demonstrating a new feature, which sparks a thought in the client's mind about something else. So they ask, hey, can FileMaker do this unrelated thing that just popped into my mind? And of course it can, right? It's FileMaker. So you say, yes, it can. Now, mind you, this was an unrelated aside to your current presentation, and you didn't respond with, wow, what a fabulous idea, I'll get on that right away, okay? Just the same, the client didn't actually hear you say, yes, it can. What they heard was, by gosh, yes, it will, and I won't even charge you for it. What a great idea that was you had, right? Now, your mileage may vary, but when I worked with Bayer to develop the first FDA-validated FileMaker system, decade and a half or so ago, the client so clearly and finitely defined the requirements and expectations of my two-person development team that when we attended the post-validation celebration dinner, I didn't even know the other 30-odd people who showed up. Turns out there was a significant QA effort in order to achieve FDA validation. But I was unaware of that at the time. I learned a lot. On the flip side, my first HIPAA-related project included actually writing my client's HIPAA compliance policies and procedures manual, which I can assure you went well beyond the realm of FileMaker. Risk assessment. Keep in mind that while you have a responsibility to be honest with your client and to communicate any risk factors, whether known at the start of your project or on the road to completion, you also have a responsibility to yourself and your business to document the client's acceptance or rejection of your assessment and or recommendations. After you've automated the hang on, I'm sorry. Yeah, I left off a bullet. There we go. If your ecosystem includes integration with external third-party products or environments, you'll want to be clear with your client about who will be responsible for what and when. After you've automated the retrieval of documents and data from DocuSign, for example, who's going to be responsible for setting up future DocuSign forms for the next campaign, for example? Are you the expert and best choice for this particular task? Is it safe to assume that your involvement is limited to the integration effort, or are you going to be receiving late-night texts about the, I forgot to mention this, but I need this tomorrow task, right? Is this going to be sprung on you? Also, if you've employed plugins, who will be responsible for purchasing the upgrades? It's not always obvious. And I urge you to review that list of non-FileMaker considerations and don't hesitate to add your own. We all want to be the best consultants and partners for our clients, but the fact that you provided specs and that you made hardware recommendations, or even that you installed FileMaker Server and set up the backup schedule, these efforts on your part should not infer that you're also responsible for maintenance of the hardware, troubleshooting of any and all network problems, or that you're even responsible for handling offsite backups. Unless, of course, these are tasks that you accept and take on explicitly. You want to be clear. Much of what's required by HIPAA, for example, is well beyond the realm of software or hardware. It involves business rules, facility access, and other policies and procedures. And the division of responsibility between your client, it may seem clear, but is it really? Role-based access, for example. It's a feature that your custom app might be required to support, but it would always be the client's responsibility to actually identify and assign who belongs with which role, right? And if you employ externally authenticated accounts, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be the one responsible for maintaining the client company's active or open directories. For communicating those responsibilities, a few things to keep in mind. First of all, the business associate agreement required by HIPAA, it codifies your legal obligations, but it does not speak to the scope of your involvement. So it's required and it's documentation, but don't assume that if you have that everybody's on the same page about what you're going to be doing for your client or what you'll be liable for. Documentation. Here I'm not referring to user documentation. I'm talking about communications with your client, preferably preserved in written form. Now, even when you have a comprehensive scope of work at the beginning of your project, I would argue that augmenting this with additional documentation is truly necessary to maintain shared expectations. Follow up your in-person meetings and conference calls with an emailed recap. Share your storytelling exercises and document workflows visually and with combined narratives where possible, so everyone's on the same page. Now, we regularly roll out new builds of Harmonix for ISS. In fact, we just released one last week. And with each new feature and change request that's included in a build, there's a ticket in a tracking system that's accessible to both us and the client. So the tickets often include not only the requested feature, but the back and forth discussions that contributed to that feature's involvement. Nothing is included in a new build until it's been sanctioned by the client following UAT, or user acceptance testing. Speaking of which, UAT, or quality assurance, is sometimes as simple as the client adding a good to go note to the ticket, after checking out the feature, of course. And this is all that's needed for most simple changes, but for more complex functionality, we've actually developed our own test plan app that allows us to write test plans, or lessons, we call them, that we can then assign to the client. And each test plan's access history, results, and comments submitted with them are recorded for our review. And test plans can be retaken, or they can be taken by multiple users, so they can be used as documentation and training tools. Now, I have personally an extensive library of compliance-related resources, but the real estate and time here is limited, so I've provided a few of the most obvious here. So following DevCon, please visit har.fm/Heather, where I'll be adding more resources after I get back to Dallas. In the meantime, this is also where you can register to receive updates on the series, Conversations on Compliance, and you can do this today. That's the bottom link there, har.fm/Heather. I will have updates for this session, and I thank you for coming. Please remember to fill out your session evaluation, and now's a good time for questions. The link is har.fm/Heather. Well, I have a question for you that I forgot to ask at the beginning. How many of you are in-house developers? Okay. And that would mean how many of you are not? There we go. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yes?
Heather, it sounds like this is a massive amount of work. And when I look at the scope of normal projects, it seems like the amount of work that needs to go on top of just what does the system need to do and those requirements is very, very substantial. What are your thoughts?
How much time do you have? Okay, it boils down to this. Yes, it's a significant investment to get involved with a compliance-related project. But the extent of that involvement will determine the extent of your effort as well. So if you are coming in on the heels of another developer, for example, onto an existing project, you know, what you have to know and what you have to understand may not be as much up front. And the particular type of compliance that you need to meet, whether you're talking about HIPAA or talking about FDA or talking about GDPR, your requirements are going to be very different. Also, there are a lot of systems where the entity that the system is for, say a medical office or like our client ISS, they may be covered by HIPAA, but that doesn't mean that the data in your solution is, you know, that it's subject to it. it all depends on the context of what you're delivering and what it's going to include. My personal feeling, having started off working with HIPAA before it was even a final rule, is that there isn't anything that's required that we can't do. And most of it boils down to the security and the various tools and steps that we use to implement unique combinations of security requirements. Of course, there's also availability and some other things, but a lot of, for HIPAA, for example, a lot of that is really external to FileMaker, external to anything you'd be working with. So with a reasonably strong familiarity with your security options and your UI tools, etc., it isn't that hard. I will share a quick story with you with Bear for the FDA project. When I showed up for my first meeting with them, I knew nothing about the FDA requirements for validation, and they never shared with me the actual regulations until the project was over. What they shared with me were specific scenarios. They shared with me those stories that I'm suggesting that you use. They gave me specific use cases and asked me, can you make it do this? I thought about it, yeah, well, yeah, I can do that. And then the next person would say, but can you make it do that? Yeah, I could do that. And the reason that it was a successful project, in my opinion, is because I wasn't being asked to translate the rules. I wasn't being asked to figure out what's the best way to go about this thing. I was just asked to deliver a specific behavior. Well, actually, multiple specific behaviors, but boiled down to the specific behaviors, they weren't any different than the requests I got from other clients. It's just that the context and the reason for them asking for those things was different. Mm-hmm.
I'm working with a school district right now with severely traumatized students.
Yes.
And we opted to host the system in their network.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got all the HIPAA for all, and so they're allowing me in to do very specific things.
Right.
When the client is one who's requesting, can you make the system do this to protect this from happening, prevent that from happening?
Right.
Are you limited in your exposure and liability because you're strictly responding to the requests that you were given? Or are you responsible because you're the developer for all of the conditions of the FDA or whatever laws you fall under simply because you're the developer? Or are you only responsible for what your client has asked you to do?
So that's an interesting question, and the answer to that has changed. So when HIPAA was, first became a final rule, there really was no liability for the developer. And we certainly had a responsibility, and we signed the business associate agreement. But what I used to say to people is there were no HIPAA police. And that isn't as true today as it was, 2000, 2001. The HITECH Act created a stopgap. It filled a gap there, and it did impose some liability. But if you, and one of the links that I've included here is what is the HITECH Act, because it does more explicitly define what your liabilities could be and what your responsibilities are. But if you look at, really going back to that original paraphrase that I did about what you're responsible for, if you are responsible with your access and controls and your employees or subcontractors, and you're following the outlined rules, which honestly aren't that hard to follow, then you're probably in pretty good shape. Ultimately, prior to HITECH, it's ultimately the covered entity that was responsible. So regardless of what the developer did, technically the covered entity was the last say, but, and then the one responsible. That's not entirely true anymore. So you do want to be familiar with what the limitations are of what you're responsible for. And that's part of why communicating with your client and setting those boundaries is important. Because if you are only responsible for, you were only asked to do this one piece of code, you're responsible for this one table, and you made recommendations for them to follow in terms of their business rules that surround use of the system, which you don't have any control over. You can't control their discretion of deciding who they're going to allow into which role. That's not yours, that's theirs. But if you communicate with them the rules that should apply, how the system should be used as you've designed it, and I'm not a lawyer, but I would expect that you would have less responsibility. I mean, you certainly could speak with someone who knows more on the legal side of it, but I haven't read or heard of any cases where someone who wasn't truly negligent in some way was held responsible there. That may be less of it may be not the same when we're talking about GDPR or something like that. And FDA, of course, is a validated system, so you're really not liable. If it's validated, it's validated, which means it's okay, but you can't change it without revalidating it, right? So it's not the same type of liability. So again, the specific regulatory authority is really going to be the one defining your limits of responsibility there, legally. Yes?
Is there any guidelines on validating through the FDA?
So I will tell you, yes, there are, and there are experts in the field for that specifically, and any company that's truly interested in FDA validation is going to be investing tens of thousands of dollars to achieve it, beyond your effort.
You mean the potential customer?
Yes.
The customer would be
Yes,
investing.
because they will hire FDA validation consultants who have nothing to do with your code, but will walk them through and get them validated. Make sure that they're doing everything that they need to do, which is all the quality assurance and documentation and testing that's necessary to get the sign-off by FDA. FDA Part 11 boils down to the electronic signature. That's the bulk of it. But to do all the things that those 4 steps requires all the security, et cetera, audit logs, and a lot of other technical things that we've got to put into place. But the majority, the bulk of your requirement for FDA Part 11 validation is around the electronic signature. It's validating that what you have in your data is accurate and someone is accountable for that data, having been entered, having been edited, having been deleted, that accountability exists. But no one's going to achieve FDA validation without bringing on a consultant external to your development effort. It would be rare.
Do you happen to have any sources where you find such individuals?
You know, it's been a few years since we've done any work with FDA. My work with Bear was 15 years ago. No, 18 years ago. Though I will say that my fellow developer on that Bear team actually messaged me this afternoon to say, Claris, really? What's the scoop? Yeah, so we're still in touch. You know, drop me a note. I may be able to get you a referral. Because I still know people. I just don't have a specific person that I can give you right now. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, we have an example about restricted field access. And I was wondering if you were doing that using strict triggers, and if so, how you think about doing that for internal
That's a good question. So the example that I showed was done with script triggers, and it was done with a combination of on enter and on modify. And the reason for the combination is because of the field formatting types behaving differently. I would not suggest that you control access on a broad basis to your fields based exclusively on that, right? That would be a huge implementation effort on your part. If you have a multitude of fields that all need to be controlled, there's going to be better, more efficient ways for you to make that happen. The reason that we use that in script triggers are for those situations where this field should be editable under some conditions, but not others. So, for example, after a record has reached a certain status level, for example, it's no longer editable, it's locked. Well, we've moved away from the days where we had to layer two fields, right? Sometimes we show this one, and sometimes we show that one, and that's a pain to work with, right? Our script triggers allow us to not have to do that because we can prevent entry, we can prevent exiting if they've done something they shouldn't do. We also use that same script, which is actually very, very simple, and it has 3 options, and in fact, those 3 options are included in the name of the script, so I never have to remember what they are, right? I can put that script on just about anything, including, say, a popover. If we give someone, we have one where we have a notes popover, but on that popover is the option to say, we're going to reject this thing, right? But if they reject it, then they have to provide a reason, right? So we don't want them to click out of the popover until they've actually provided us that reason. So we've attached the exact same script that I was using in those fields to the popover itself, attached to an on-object exit. And we just feed it the right parameter to say, yes, you are or are not able to do this. And it locks them down. It works flawlessly. So, but I would use it on a limited basis for fields. It does control access to radio buttons and checkboxes, though, in a way that other things don't. The reason that the fields behave differently is because checkboxes and radio buttons choose to run their on-enter after the edit's actually already occurred, because it is the act of selecting something that enters the field, and that's why they behave differently. So the script triggers work very well for certain field types. Yes?
You talked a bit about the requirements for electronic signature.
Yes.
I'm wondering in the projects that you've done, if you could give an example or two of how that's going to be implemented, what kind of ways would you implement?
Sure. So, as I was saying earlier about FDA, FDA boils down in large part to the electronic signature. All of the effort surrounding that, it's actually a pretty significant effort to do the electronic signature for an entire system like that, because it affects everything. If the entire system has this electronic signature requirement, it's not the same as if you just have one table or one field that you have to control. But when you have to control the entire system, it means that you have to control entry to the system and access, and that you have to control your editing, that you have to audit changes when they're made and be able to control them. But if you also think about it a little more simply, even details that we have natively and automatically in our tables right now, our creation timestamp and creation by, and the modification and modified by, those are in effect doing part of what the electronic signature requires. If something changes, the old signature's gone and a new one's replacing it. It invalidated the old one and replaced it with a new one automatically. So there's a lot that's more, let me rephrase, there's a lot that's simpler than you would think it is.
So in the simplest of forms, you could say that if you have,
Right.
At the end of their process, clicking a button which timestamps everything that's in their credentials from their own Active Directory, that you might consider the simplest of forms of electronic signature.
Right.
But then if somebody goes in and is able to, for some other reason, to modify something on their record, it shouldn't validate that signature and either remove it or log that it's made a change.
Correct. So the system that I worked on for Bear specifically, it was called EMAC, which was the Electronic Maintenance and Calibration System. And it ran the maintenance department. It basically tracked timesheets for the maintenance staff and inventory for maintenance. So they had these, and I don't remember what they call them, but basically whenever there's maintenance required on a piece of equipment, then you have this predefined package of parts that you're going to need. It's kind of like, you're going to get, an oil change, you need this. You're going to get your tire changed, you need these parts, right? So they had these pre-built inventory of parts and equipment that were on hand. And because the maintenance department was maintaining equipment used to manufacture pharmaceuticals, that software had to be FDA validated. So there was nothing in there that had to do with medicine, nothing that had to do with sensitive information, but it was crucial to maintenance of the equipment that was very involved with the medication, right? So we couldn't, for example, allow someone to change their time card because that could be obstructing valid information and history about what actually happened, right? If there had been an issue with a piece of equipment and someone could go back and falsify what they had done, that would be unacceptable. So which is where I got it, what I meant by talking about in context of the solution. If you look at the rules and the requirements that you're being asked to fulfill and address, if you can really get to the meat of why are they asking you to do this, what is it we're really trying to achieve here, that'll help a great deal in determining how best to address it.
So if you had a table that had 50 fields in it, but you, in some kind of document, defined that these 20 fields are the critical fields which require the electronic signature.
Mm-hmm.
As long as those aren't getting modified, because there could be some
Sure.
objective fields that could get changed after the fact.
Right.
If they're getting modified and it's audited that the change was in the other fields, then you should be okay with it.
Right, which is right, so if that's the case, then you want to be looking at something that's more of a field level validation versus a record level restriction, right? And sometimes, if you look at how is that data actually going to be used, it may steer you towards separating that data into two separate tables, even if it's via a one-to-one relationship, because then you have more absolute control. We're just going to control these records. We're just going to control the whole thing versus these fields. And if you're talking about a half dozen fields, probably not a big deal. One way or the other, it's going to take more effort to do the separate tables probably than to do just a handful of fields. But if you're talking about 30 fields out of 120, then maybe it's worth considering a different schema, right? And that's why you want to understand what you're really being asked to do as early as possible so you can make the right decisions. Yeah. You're welcome. All right. Thank you, everyone, for hanging in.